Day 3. What a nightmare. We rose early, intending to inquire at the Druid Grove after Nettie, who had been told yesterday evening was the healer in residence. Master Halcyon, the first druid of this circle and its chief healer, was off with those adventurers we'd rescued at the gate and didn't return with them. Or, rather, he was abandoned by them, I should say. It does not seem to be Halcyon's choice that he didn't return. What should have been a simple errand turned into a wild goose chase. Corga, the new first druid in Halcyon's absence, is a staunch isolationist and refuses to even speak with the nominal leader of the tiefling refugees, whom she intends to evict through some druidic rite to seal the grove off from the outside. Not all of the druids seem to be in accord on this matter, so it's taking them much longer to complete the ritual than Corga would like. This buys us time. Time to hopefully retrieve Halcyon from the clutches of this goblin army and see if he can heal our infections. Regardless, we jumped through Corga's hoops for her all day, hoping to earn an audience with Nettie. Regrettably, it turned out Nettie was unable to help us. Halcyon would seem to be our surest hope. Not that we don't have other options, Diary, merely that they seem more far-flung, or far-fetched. Lae'zel has found evidence that there is a Githyanki creche nearby, and according to her, there's a device specifically tailored to extracting mind flayer tadpoles from infected individuals who are recovered and brought for treatment in time. I've been able to corroborate that there may be a creche somewhere along the Risen Road, based on the appearance of red dragons in my survey of the near future. The cards have confirmed it as well. I read them thrice. However, the exact location eludes me. I suspect that, much like locations in the Underdark, the Gith are taking steps to shield their location from divination magic. In the past, I could ask my lord to reveal such information, but right now I feel so distant from him. I do not feel his divine spark in my fingers when I draw upon the weave. Oh, my lord, my strength, do not be far off. I have not forsaken you, I swear it. I shall prepare an altar tonight for you. In fact, I must discuss that with Shadowheart. Another possibility, though quite remote, is the offer from that woman, Ethel. She seems to be some sort of alchemist and may be able to present a solution. The potions and salves she brought for sale were incredibly potent, but out of the price range of the refugees. Even beyond the reach of my purse away from my vaults. She was very cooperative, though, willing to make deals with interested parties for her goods. She didn't seem completely horrified by the prospect of our tadpoles either, more sympathetic than anything. No, sympathetic isn't the right word. There's something off about her. It might be worth investigating anyway, if only to make sure she doesn't turn up to drain us of our lymph and bile later. I've got to go now, Diary. After today, we're all quite peckish, and Gale's roasting a leg of lamb with mint and a parsnip puree. Had he not been one of Mistress Chosen, he might have had a calling as a private chef. Simon laid his journal aside and sat for a long moment, unmoving as all the things he said in his writing, and all the things he didn't say, ran through his mind. He and the others killed a woman, depriving the grove of its healer. He and the others rescued 3 children from being devoured by harpies. You died. Yes, there was that too. Simon's stomach flipped and flopped like a little fish in the bottom of a boat. Vladimir's excited cries flitted into his mind. The boy was far too young to go hunting with him, but angling was fine. Oh, Lord, if the others hadn't been there today. Vladimir might never have known Papa was dead. Death was so near at hand with the prospect of the tadpoles, he'd neglected the 10,000 other ways death could find him. He needed to be more careful. They all did. Simon emerged from his tent. He needed to clear his head. Karlak was tossing a now somewhat singed bone for Scratch, the dog they'd passed on the road yesterday who tracked their scent back to camp and now refused to leave. Will and Gale seemed to be chatting amiably while a shimmering mage hand slowly rotated the spit the roast was speared on. but Simon noted the unusually rigid stance Will was using, the way a noble stood in a ballroom if he was hoping to blend in with the waitstaff. He was nervous about something. Lae'zel was up to her usual evening routine of sharpening every blade in camp, and while Simon understood meditative practice as well as anyone, he would have preferred something a bit quieter. Astarion seemed quite relaxed. Lying on a richly woven rug, he adjusted his entire tent to accommodate, and flicking through one of the dusty tomes they'd retrieved from Wither's old home contentedly. Shadowheart, it seemed, was nowhere near at hand. Curious and slightly concerned, Simon approached her tent. Shadowheart stood alone just outside the flap of her tent, goblet of wine in hand, and her gaze focused on Simon as he approached. She could see the whole camp from her vantage point, but Simon was sharply aware that it was not out of a benevolent desire to keep watch over them all. "Shadowheart, how are you holding up over here?" Simon asked, smiling.
"Well enough, I suppose," she began.
She opened her mouth as if to continue, but reconsidered her words quickly.
"Wondering when our luck is going to run out, really."
True. I thank you for bringing me back. But I wonder how much longer I have, anyway. I don't even know if one can be resurrected if they die from ceremorphosis. Is the Mind Flayer you? Does your soul depart when the process is complete? Were you to be raised by a sufficiently powerful cleric, would you come back as you were in health or just before the transformation was complete?
All rather morbid questions,
Shadowheart said, though she seemed to approve of the disgusting dialogue if her little head tilt and quirk of the lips was any indication.
Though I think the consensus is that you die. The Mind Flayer is not you. A sufficiently powerful cleric can restore you to just about any point in your life prior to your death. But even I don't know any clerics that powerful, so the question is moot. At least, I don't think I know any clerics that powerful, she said, glancing away as if she might catch sight of a memory.
Nor I. Simon shook his head. The only other among us who might have friends or acquaintances that powerful would be Gale, and clerics don't tend to consort much with wizards. Present company excluded. He laughed. He was pleasantly surprised to find her laughing along with him.
I think all of us are exceptions to the rule, she smiled.
An easy moment of pleasant silence stretched between them, the sound of camp behind them a gentle source of ambiance. Not to leave a pleasant subject, but there was a reason I came over here tonight. I wonder if we might have a word.
Of course. About what?
Well, it does so happen to be somewhat related. I was hoping we might discuss, matters of worship.
Here it comes,
she huffed, crossing her arms. She should have known it was too good to be true. No disapproval, ma'am, I assure you, he said, holding his hands up as he saw the shield drawn around her once again. In fact, since you were so forthcoming about your lady in the end, I thought I would return the gesture. A sign of goodwill, trust, mutually assured destruction, he added playfully, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes this time. Shadowheart raised a well-plucked brow and leaned in a little closer.
I'm listening.
In my home of Fontdale, we worship the god of the one who made the claim on the land, my ancestors' lord. Simon could sense Shadowheart's building impatience and let out a small sigh. I worship the dark star. Hadar, the dark hunger, he said, the tension in the air around him crystallizing like hoarfrost.
Can't say I'm familiar,
Shadowheart said, piercing that tension in a most dissatisfying way.
Never passed his temple before.
My god has no hallowed hall in Baldur's Gate. Nor anywhere outside of Fontdale. Away from the Grand Cathedral, we are the temples. And we worship through acts of hedonism, he explained. Shadowheart wrinkled her nose and leaned away. Not like that, I assure you. Unless the devotee wishes, of course, but... Well, as the high priest and prophet, if I worshipped in such a way, I would have died of exhaustion long ago. Or boredom, he said with an embarrassed laugh. No, I worship in smaller ways, but with more continuous adoration. Fine clothes, bright colours, indulgent foods. Though something as simple as a glass of fine wine shared in good company is a wonderful act of devotion. New experiences and memories are the most prized offerings one can make, though, and I'm certainly having plenty of those now.
I see.
And I suppose I was wondering, as a fellow follower in the dark, if you would permit me to worship alongside you in the evenings. It might make things a little less lonesome for you here.
Perhaps solitude is the best way, Shadowheart said, cautiously peering over the walls of her defenses. Though I admit, it seems we're more kindred spirits than I initially thought. And if your worship involves wine, then I can hardly think of a better group for you to be stranded out here with. Except maybe for Karlak and her beer and ale, but there might be hope for her yet.
I imagine she'll drink anything we put in front of her, Simon chuckled. And it is the experience my lord savours, so truly putting anything in front of her ought to be intriguing. But I see I'm overstaying. I shall see you at supper, Miss Shadowheart.
Likewise. I'll clear some space for you tonight, she said, smiling slightly as Simon left.
That had gone much better than he'd anticipated, to be honest. He headed back to the others with a bit of spring in his step, a touch of anticipatory joy helping to settle the squirming in his stomach. Oh, Simon, do you have a moment? Astarion asked, flicking his book shut and rising. I suppose I do. Supper isn't quite ready yet, it seems, Simon said, gesturing to the cook fire. Ha! Funny you should mention that. Astarion laughed easily, forcing himself to keep his eyes on Simon's, instead of looking down at his neck. Seeing as I will necessarily be skipping dinner, you're more than welcome to sit and eat with us, Simon offered with a disarming smile. I do wonder how welcome I'd be, sitting with the others around the fire with my fangs in someone's neck, Astarion replied. Some of them are ready to stake me just at the thought of my being here. I don't think anyone can question your presence after today, Simon said, his expression growing a touch more serious. I hear you were quite something, fighting the dire wolf. My memory of the whole affair is a little hazy. Thank you, darling. Regardless, I'd rather not give anyone reason to reconsider, and I don't think we want any more midnight surprises. Although, dare I say, you got the blood pumping. Astarion smirked. I'd prefer not as well, though I do believe I'm seeing what you're gesturing to, Simon said. You need blood, and I need to not be awakened suddenly in the middle of the night. You're keen. Perhaps we can come to some sort of arrangement? Astarion smirked, jutting his hip out. Tit for tat, as it were. No exchange is necessary. Simon smiled, though his cheeks warmed slightly at Astarion's suggestive tone. No, don't be silly. He always spoke like that. As long as you continue to perform admirably. Perhaps we could arrange that you should come to me before I go to sleep after my watch. On evenings I have watch anyway. I'll already be awake then, at least, Simon said softly. Fair enough. As for tonight, shall I pay you a visit before we all turn in? I think that would be reasonable, Simon said, doing his best to remain calm at the thought. Then I'll see your delicious self tonight, Astarion purred.
Lady of Loss, guide us through the dark and shield us from scrutiny. Weave your shadows over us and protect us in our sorrows.
I hope I'm not late, Simon said. May I come in? He asked before brushing open the flap of her tent.
You're just in time. Shadowheart smiled, patting a purple cushion next to her in front of her impromptu altar.
The cushion was lumpy and aged, but she'd knocked most of the dust from it. These past few days they'd all managed to make this little patch of riverfront land more of a home with what they'd scavenged or traded for with the Druids and Elturellan refugees. Though hope of finding an idol of Shar was a nigh impossible task, Shadowheart had bridged the gap with a shallow silver bowl, filled with a combination of wine and blood based on the scent wafting from it.
"I've made a bit of room for you. It shouldn't be a problem as long as you don't worship at the wrong side of the altar."
"I understand. Hadar isn't particularly offended by misplaced praise, but Lady Shaw's quite jealous as I hear it."
Simon smiled, kneeling and unfolding a small silk bundle. Shadowheart watched curiously as he began arranging items on the plank she'd erected. A bowl of sand for incense, a cluster of deep purple amethyst, a long dark octopus tentacle sealed in amber, a bottle of anointing oil, a vicious obsidian dagger, a fragment of bone, a set of tarot cards? No, the stack was far too small. He lit his incense with a mere touch of his fingertips, the musky smoke carrying a citrus note that gave it an edge, a point, razor sharp. It was, she decided, quite pleasant, like a handsome man's cologne, like casting a spell on an oceanside cliff. He uncapped the little crystal vial of oil and tipped a few drops over onto his fingertips, touching the blessed oil to each of his core points, from the crown of his head to his groin.
"O Dark Lord, I purify myself in your gaze. Enter unto this temple and use this tongue for your own,"
Simon murmured reverently, running his oiled fingers along the flat of the chipped stone blade and passing it 3 times through the incense smoke. He sat for a moment, blade held in his hands and his eyes closed in silent worship. His lips parted slightly and a low, soft sigh of breath left him, waiting, she presumed, for his god to speak. He'd said he was a diviner, a prophet. Shadowheart had never heard of prophecy being given, and found herself leaning a little closer in anticipation. Simon drew a long breath through his nose, held it for a moment, and once again breathed out slowly, raising a brow.
"Need something?" he asked, opening one eye with a sly little smile.
"Just curious," Shadowheart replied, settling back on her cushion.
"He usually doesn't speak outside of High Holy Days," Simon sighed, "but I always give him the opportunity."
He closed his eyes again and raised the obsidian blade, touching the very tip to his forehead. He held that position perfectly still, with all the ease of marble, until long after Shadowheart finished her evening prayers. When she finally looked back over to Simon, her gaze flicked up to the dagger point against his forehead. Over the course of several long minutes, he'd pulled the blade away from his skin millimeter by millimeter, the pace imperceptibly slow. In the space between blade tip and flesh, what appeared to be a small point of crystal had grown, opaque and tinged a sickly, waxy green. She watched as one hand left the grip of his dagger, a human-sized jawbone, she noted, and gently pinched the crystal between his fingers. As soon as he touched the gem, a strange stillness overtook the tent, as if a note she hadn't realized was being sung was suddenly silenced. "What is that?" she asked softly, leaning close.
"A sacrifice for my god," Simon replied, rubbing his forehead lightly. "Didn't expect it to be so large."
"So that's—"
"Memory. Emotions tied to that memory, rather," Simon clarified. "I try not to sacrifice whole memories, they're far too important. But details, like the flavor and disappointment of a burnt dinner roll, are relatively safe to give away. I've eaten burnt food before, and I will do so again, I'm sure, so giving up any individual occasion's no issue. And then all I remember is the meal was inadequate."
"May I ask what this one is, then?" Shadowheart cocked her head in that way she so often did, her bound braids swinging around to the front of her shoulder.
"The feeling of dying," Simon replied bluntly, turning it over in his fingers as if to inspect it. It's not something a man is meant to feel more than once, and I fear if I hold on to it, I may not have the strength to do what must be done, to overcome the fear of that pain, to take necessary risks. Simon chuckled dryly, continuing to turn the crystal over in his hand. Ordinarily, I'd never sacrifice the first time for anything, but first time burning to death is an exception I'm willing to make. Will was the first to notice, of course. He was always on guard, always watching, always dreading. So when the shadows started to draw unnaturally, slickly slipping across the packed earth and pebbles of the riverbank, he stopped dead in his tracks, and Gale nearly collided with him. A little warning next time? Gale chuckled, unsloshing his drink off of Will's shoulder with a purplish rush of the weave. Hell's fire. She's coming, Will said, his eyes widening. Who? Gale asked. Simon rose from his place by the fire, his lips pressed tight. With his attention drawn, it was impossible not to see threads of fate, fire red, pulling to one spot not 2 meters away, to not sense the building of magic at that spot. Sweet Gale, had he not been slightly sodded, would have noticed it right away as well, rather than only once the scent of brimstone made itself known. All eyes were drawn, however, when the oily shadows pulled apart and left a flaming hole in the plain, the surface rippling as a curvy figure rose up, tall, winged, horned, and oozing infernal confidence. The thick darkness clinging to her form burned away, revealing a finely dressed and bejeweled, red-haired Cambion. Her wings stretched out and nostrils flared delicately as she took a breath of cool air from the material plane. Will, she smiled, casting her hooded gaze on the man. Her tone was sensuous, but dripped with poison. You've been naughty. And you know what happens when you're naughty, she teased, her rich voice clinging to each word, her forked tongue tapping every T at the back of her pointed teeth. She was clearly relishing in putting on this little show. Gods damn it, anyone but her, Carlac groaned, rolling her eyes. Pardon me, madam, but I must ask who you are and what you're doing in our camp, Simon said, drawing himself up and taking on the lordly tone he'd used so often that day. Oh, he's a gentleman, the devil purred, holding her ring-filled hand out as if half expecting it to be taken and kissed, though she did not wait for Simon to move. Call me Mizora. I'm Will's patron, the font of his power. My pet's been unruly, and his leash needs a yank, she said, curling her long fingers and pulling her fist back. With a grunt, Will was jerked forward by the neck, stumbling half a step before trying to find his footing and pull away, struggling against the unseen leash she had before merely suggested. We had a deal, Will, but Carlac is still breathing, she said, the sultry tone beginning to leave as she turned instead to business. I've taken more pleasant shits than you, Mizora, and at least those can be buried after. Carlac fired back, smoke rising from her exhaust. That's no kind of talk for a lady, Mizora simpered in Carlac's direction, uncaring in the moment of the way Will struggled and gasped. By the way, Carlac, Zariel sends her regards, she teased. You told me devils only! She's a tiefling, not a monster! Will grunted past the invisible caller, choking him for his insolence. How precious the pups found his bark, Mizora smirked, her burning gaze flicking back to Will. Clause G, Section 9. Targets should be limited to the infernal, the demonic, the heartless, and the soulless, she recited without hesitation or reference. Oh, delightful. Astarion thought, his words carried disdainfully to nearby tadpoles. A contract lawyer. Karlak meets the criteria, pet. Trust me on this. Madam, despite your unannounced appearance, I am doing my utmost to be a gracious host, Simon began, taking a step forward with a stern expression. But you are making yourself a very poor guest with this behavior. If you do not release Will, or do anything to harm Karlak, then I shall have to take drastic measures to protect my place and people. Drastic measures? Mizora laughed. You're all out of mana, young master. I may be out of mana, but I am not out of options, Simon replied, his tone deceptively pleasant, just as hers was deceptively seductive. Mizora considered him for a moment, quirking a well-kept brow upward. Careful what you wish for, she said, tutting her tongue and wagging a finger in his direction before turning back to Will. Which reminds me, you wanted the power of the hells. Then you shall have it. Mizora's grin grew predatory as she snapped her fingers. Will's shadow in the firelight solidified, holding him in place and taking on an oily sheen as another portal opened beneath his feet, the thick, dark, crawling up his restrained form. A scream tore its way out of Will's throat, past the collar Mizora had been tugging on and past the bubbling surface of the infernal portal, though his physical form remained in place. He flinched and jerked and writhed, his body snapping and contorting away from unseen threats and struggling against invisible bonds and blows. More and more oily black sludge seemed to flow up onto his form, weighing him down, dragging him to his knees before his patron, and leaving him looking like a lumpy, malformed pile of sludge. Karlak's stomach lurched. It looked a hell of a lot like a lemure. The sludge dropped away, leaving only the same thin film that had lingered on Mizora when she had arrived. It, too, burned off of his form with brimstone flame, but the man who stood before them was not the same. A pair of great curved horns had burst forth from his skull. His left eye had gone black and red, and his form-fitting shirt was now stretched taut over the ridges and spines of a tiefling. That's better, Mizora smirked, surveying her handiwork as Will struggled to his feet, stumbling sideways at the unexpected weight of his head. What the hells have you done? Will asked, his hands gingerly feeling out the curve of his enormous horns, horror in his eyes. A promise broken, a price paid. You know the terms. Get used to the new form, pet. There's no going back. Some magic even I can't undo, Mizora said, gleeful in her declaration. You're so concerned with tieflings, let's see how you handle being one. She laughed as each minute shift of Will's head threatened to pull him off balance, unused to the weight. Karlak, keep an eye on him, will you? I'll be keeping mine on you, Mizora smirked, her gaze turning to Simon. And I know I'm not the only one. Oh, and Will, our pact still stands. Ta-ta, she called, disappearing in a flash of smoke and flames. Hell's bleeding fire, Will. I didn't know you were tangled up in all this shit, Karlak said. Sorry I must have caught wind I was trying to escape. Or Mizora just put a hit out on me for fun because she's a skanky bitch, she muttered. Gods. Oh, gods. Will nearly sobbed, his fingers running over more and more of his body, territory made unfamiliar and hostile as his fingertips brushed ridges and protrusions, catching on his calluses and sending unfamiliar sensations up his spine as new nerves felt for the first time. Shocks inside and outside his system, his ribs, his chest, his face. Excuse me, I've got to go, Will said quickly, turning and hurrying away from the campfire, heading for the pebbly beach. "Should we make sure he doesn't go drown himself?" Astarion asked, his expression oddly hard to read beyond keen interest. "I think that's wise," Simon nodded, "but let's give him a minute. Unless we hear him start sloshing into the river." "Hey, guys," Karlak began, leaning down to whisper. "If she's made him a tiefling, though, where's his tail?" Will couldn't tell if it was a blessing or a curse that this little tributary of the Chionthar moved just fast enough that he couldn't catch sight of his reflection. This is a test, he always tried to tell himself, but he could think of no god or goddess who would have taken such an unfair interest in him. And were it a test from Mizora, it would only be of how far she could push the envelope. "Oh, Tyr, blind one, care not about this twisted form and judge only my heart, my words, my deeds," he prayed softly. "Speaker of truth, hand of righteousness, guide me on this journey. Oh, one who endures," he whispered, his throat closing around the words. This wasn't him, and he knew it. He wasn't devout. He wasn't true to a divine guide. If he had been, he mightn't have taken a deal with the devil in the first place. Tyr and Torm weren't moved by crocodile tears and cries of contrition after judgment, and while Ilmater might take pity on a man crying out in desperation, a man crying out in vanity was unlikely to be heard. That's what this was, wasn't it? To be made to look like a monster. No, it was unfair to think of tieflings as monsters, or devils. That was old-fashioned and common of him. The platitudes rang hollow in his mind as his head sagged under the weight of the horns, now dragging his head to and fro, as his body had stretched in places it was not meant to. Swallowing heavily, Will forced his hands away from the horns which had erupted from his head and felt along his cheekbones. And there was a definite ridge to them now. "Need more padding inside helmets," some disconnected part of himself thought, tabulating his changes clinically, coldly, strategically. Driven by morbid curiosity and this stoic inspector in his head, Will's fingers slid back to his ears, where he did not find the points he expected. They were round and human-like, just as before, but something didn't feel quite right. The helix fold at the top ended abruptly, as though his ear had been cut to be rounded, though they weren't raw or bloody. They were scarred that way. His fingernails were flat, as usual, not the claws that tiefling nails usually tended toward, and they did seem to be cut back quite short. Shorter than he kept his nails on his own, anyway, the tips of his fingers tender. He ran his tongue over his teeth again and again, expecting fangs. Instead, they were still flat, but with sharp edges, like they'd been filed flat, without polish or rounding. Less care than a horse's hoof gets. He was starting to realize with more of his unfamiliar new anatomy he explored. He had been made to look the way he had before. As if he had been cut down to fit this shape. One hand felt down his now ridged back, finding a firm protrusion at the base of his spine. A tail, he thought immediately, but where Karlak and the refugees had long, whip-like tails, expressive, useful. He felt only a scarred, foreign nub. His tail had been cut off. Docked. Like a dog. "Will, are you there?" Simon called softly, waiting around the tangle of reeds and brush to be acknowledged, to be permitted to approach. We've brought some of Shadowheart's favorite Pinot Grigio and some of Carlack's favorite Dwarven Ale. One is bound to make you feel your troubles less. Will removed his hand from the back of his trousers and stood. He hadn't noticed that he'd sunk to his knees in desperate prayer on the pebbly shore. He quickly wiped his face against the back of his arm. There were no tears. Not yet. But it was almost reflex to make motions at cleaning himself up. "Thank you, Simon, that is most courteous," he said, defaulting back to the courtly talk he'd been raised around. Despite his detached vocabulary, at least his voice sounded the same. Didn't rasp against infernal iron or brimstone in his throat as he spoke. Simon approached, holding the wine, Astarion swaggering behind him with the bottle of ale, its label half torn. "We didn't bring glasses, I'm afraid, so we'll just have to pass the bottle round," Astarion said, deliberately avoiding the topic of the hour, at least for the moment. "We didn't want you to think we'd abandoned you." Simon smiled sympathetically, holding the bottle out for him to choose. "Thank you, but I think I'll have the ale tonight," Will said, trying to find his usual down-to-earth tone again. He couldn't run from this. Couldn't just disconnect, sweep under the rug. No. This was a burden his shoulders would have to be broad enough to carry. He had no choice. Astarion pulled the cork from the bottle's neck with a low pop and flung the cork into the water. "Careful with that. Who knows what your tolerance might be now?" he advised, a little smirk in his voice. "I dare say you're done giving us a show tonight." "Indeed, didn't intend for the one we got," Will sighed, accepting the bottle. "These sorts of transformations, and all that comes after, are rarely what we intend," Astarion said, a knowing tone in his voice. "At least you have a written contract with your devil, twisted though it may be." "Yeah, didn't exactly get to go over the fine print," Will said, his throat closing and his tongue growing sluggish in his mouth. The bonds of his contract. A warning. Speak no more. "Well, perhaps on a quiet evening I can have a look over your contract," Astarion smirked. "See what loopholes Mizora left in for her benefit. Beat the devil at her own game. The translation might be troublesome, though. As far as I know, the only person around here fluent in Infernal is Carlack, and no offense to her, she's wonderful, top marks, love the bloodshed. But I don't expect she's particularly learned in contract law." "Yeah, right. Thanks, Astarion," Will said rather flatly as he took a swig from the bottle. It did burn. It felt oddly thick, like molten metal. Ah, dwarves. "You didn't happen to pick up any infernal on your little journey through the layers of the hells, did you?" Astarion asked, brow raised. "Thank you, Astarion. I think I can handle it from here," Simon advised gently. "I'll see you later." "Yes, you will. You sweet, generous thing," Astarion purred, brushing a teasing finger across Simon's jaw and tucking an imagined wisp of hair behind his ear enticingly before departing. Will sighed, watching as Simon repeated the little touch. The encore surely wasn't as pleasant, but he couldn't miss the hint of smile that lingered on Simon's lips. "Why do you let him talk to you and touch you like that? It's improper, it is." Simon smiled a little wider. "Oh, I suppose I rather like it. It's nice to know someone finds you appealing, even if they only want one thing," he said, gesturing to his neck. Will frowned. "But aren't you spoken for?" Simon blinked, his expression growing a bit more formal, more guarded. "Whatever gave you that impression?" Will locked eyes with him, the new flame red and night black of his left, and the cold, enchanted stone of his right. "I know there's a Lady Fontdale." Will stated with all the cool authority of a page from Histories Ancient and Modern of the Peerage and Patriars. Simon stood silent, the smile sliding from his face and his gaze flicking away under Will's judgmental stare. Vladimir didn't very well spring up from the ground fully formed, did he? He cleared his throat and turned back to Will, attempting to compose himself with so many frayed edges. You cannot blame yourself for being deceived by Miss Aura, Simon began, inelegantly changing the topic of discussion. Simon felt the tadpole twitch inside his skull, hungry and alert, eager for this rise in emotion, soaking in the cascade of chemicals and keen to connect. Well, I suppose you'd know something about deception, wouldn't you? Will scoffed. Do I detect a rebuke? Simon snapped, a sharpness entering his expression that Will hadn't seen before. Not directed at an ally, anyway. You don't know the first thing about it, you child. You think yourself so much better than I ought to... Simon stopped mid-sentence. From where he found himself swelling in growing anger, leaning into Will's face, Simon saw the face of a white lily more clearly than ever before, reflected in the one good eye of a startled man. I'm terribly sorry, Will. That wasn't very gentlemanly of me just now, he said, backing up a step and a half. I don't know what came over me. It's all right. It's been a long day for everyone, Will said, straightening back up and watching Simon cautiously. I expect we'll feel at least a bit better in the morning, about one thing or another, he said, slightly shaken from what he'd just seen. Yes, I suppose you're right. Good evening to you, Simon said, his hand rising to rub lightly at his forehead. There was a dull throb there, behind his third eye, and something that felt like a sloshing about in the hole he had so carefully carved that night. As he walked back to camp, he couldn't help but feel that there on that beach, he'd lost something he could never get back. Or perhaps had something planted that he didn't want.